There were very strange rumors in the Sapphire Palace where the emperor lived, and all the maids were whispering about what was going on there. In fact, everyone who had ever seen the ghost told the same story. But the ghost was definitely special because it only disappeared after cleaning. But in fact, it is not a ghost at all, but an ordinary girl, and few people realize that the so-called ghost is a maid from the imperial palace. It all began with one book where lived in the world noble saint all around loved the girl because she was the main character of the novel. Her name was Felicia, but one day the girl ran into a maid passing by and asked that the maid send her to the prayer place in the West Wing. And the maid of course agreed, and so Felicia entered the room accompanied by only one maid, as she had once promised Melania. But surprisingly, the girl only smiled, wondering how Felicia could be so stupid, and informed her that she was too easily fooled, and wondered if the girl was even thinking when she acted. Finally, at that very moment, the doors were locked behind her, leaving only Melanie, her subordinates, and Felicia in the room. But the readers immediately noticed something wrong, and so in the comments to this chapter there was total chaos, because it was clearly written that the maid came in with Felicia, and everyone was wondering if the author just forgot about this maid. But the protagonist only awkwardly reflects on the fact that her life was exactly the same, and not at all different from that inconspicuous maid, and asked the people in the comments not to be so rude. In the end, the main character just wanted to sympathize with the girl who seemed to be in a similar situation. But the next time she opened her eyes, she literally couldn't recognize herself. And she also remembered that the maid from whom the protagonist had asked for help had been so inconspicuous, as if she hadn't even existed. And the protagonist just wanted to sympathize. But one comment ruined her life, which was obvious from the beginning. The main character thought that she was asleep, and so after 2 hours of looking at herself in the mirror, the girl calmly went to bed, thinking that she just needed some sleep, and then everything would be as before. And in the end, it took 6 months for the protagonist to realize that it was not a dream and was happening in reality. In the end, the novel was finished a year ago, and so the protagonist had nothing left but to accept her new reality and come to terms with this life. And so she just started doing her duties as a maid, which she was. And she thought about the fact that initially it took a long time to change clothes. And of course, it wasn't just her clothes that bothered her, because she really had the impression that absolutely no one noticed her. But it wasn't the other maids that were the problem, because they really didn't see her. And so the protagonist realized she was in the body of the very maid she was protecting, and she didn't even recognize her own name right away. And she thought that she might not even be working at all, since no one noticed her anyway. But afterwards, she sadly thought about the fact that she had nothing to be surprised about, because in her past life, no one even knew if this girl was studying with her group, because they just didn't notice her before, and so they didn't know who she was. And all her life, the girl lived as if invisible. But after, to distract herself from such thoughts, the protagonist started cleaning, and looking at her work thought that nothing could spoil such a wonderful day. And now she could clean even with her eyes closed. But eventually a woman came up behind her and stepped on her without noticing. And only when she looked around, she noticed the girl and asked when she had time to appear here, because she had not seen her before. And the awkward protagonist said that she had been here from the beginning, and for quite a long time. And then the woman just awkwardly thought about the fact that the protagonist always managed to take her by surprise, and wondered if she had finished cleaning. But after looking around at everything, she was pleased to announce that now the heroine could go to the dining room and help with the serving, as the prince and the emperor would soon arrive, and everything had to be perfect. And then she agreed and immediately went on working, and the head maid looked after her only thought that this girl worked well and was also kind. But for some reason, she constantly had a feeling as if she did not exist at all, and wondered if she could just be called a ghost like that. But the next thing she knew, she didn't even know the name of the main character. So she had to open a list of all the maids, and then she could finally find the name of the main character. Her name was Maria Meyer, and so the woman thought that maybe this girl was just cursed. But then she thought it was probably just nonsense, because she had never heard of such a curse, since it looked more like a general oblivion. Elias von Lonkelber was the 5th man in line to the throne, and 2 years ago, no one would have thought that it would be Elias von Lonkelber who would win the internecine war. But the first prince was too weak, the second died young, the third was accused of treason, and the fourth decided to devote himself to the church. And the 6th married a princess from a neighboring state. And to everyone's surprise, it was Elias von Lonkelber who held out until the very end, and he planned everything from the very beginning. that's how he managed to become the heir. And then the maid who had told the story to her friend said that it was the first time that the emperor had chosen to invite the prince to share a dinner with him. And also Prince Elias von Lockelber admired the Crystal Palace, so he would most likely stay there. And then the other maid remembered that they were looking for suitable workers, but it was unlikely that they would hire someone from outside the palace, and most likely they would be invited from the other palaces. And the servants would be treated very well there. And then the girls thought that apparently any of them could be called to the Crystal Palace. Whereupon the admiring maid began to reflect that she was madly desirous of the position, for she thought Elias von Lockelber was wonderful. But the other maids excitedly inquired whether this girl had not heard the rumors that were going around Elias von Lockelber. But the girl calmly declared that she did not care, for he was very nice and also handsome. But at this moment, interrupting their conversation from the back, and appeared the protagonist, who held out a knife and said that she had brought it to give it to them. And the madly frightened maids looking at the protagonist tried to understand who she was. After that, they remembered that they had asked someone to bring them a knife, but they did not remember that this request was addressed to the main character, and therefore they were frightened. But at that moment, Maria Meyer calmly asked if she had brought them the wrong knife, and then the girls with tears in their eyes ran away. But the protagonist was not satisfied to look at this picture, and thought that only recently these girls had asked her for a knife, and then thought that such a reaction was not new to her. But after looking at the mess the fleeing maids had left behind, she realized that she should just take the initiative, and she would rather clean than sit around with nothing to do. And she considered such qualities to be professionalism. But the head maid looked around and wondered where all the other maids had gone. And then the awkward protagonist spoke to her and said that it looked like they had run away because of her. And from what she heard, the head maid was very much surprised. But she believed it, for Maria Meyer could really surprise with her sudden appearance. Then she said that she would find the other maids and asked the girl to take care of dinner. Then she said that the protagonist should not forget that she should also attend the meeting where she would stand in the corner and help if necessary. But after looking around the room, she asked her to stand not in her former place, but near the window. And the excited Maria Meyer wondered if it was too close to the table. But then she calmly thanked the head maid. In the end, the frightened maids immediately went back to work when the head maid asked them to. And Maria Meyer was thinking of Prince Elias von Lockelber, for she had never seen him up close. But maybe today would be the day she'd get her first look at him, and wondered if this guy was really as creepy as they said he was, and hoped it would go smoothly. Eventually, some time passed, and then everyone bowed to announce the arrival of His Highness, the 5th Prince Elias von Lockelber. And then a young man appeared in the room. But as he sat down in his seat and looked ahead of him, he noticed that the chair opposite him was empty, which meant that His Majesty was still on his way. And then a disgruntled Elias von Lockelber reflected on the fact that his father had never learned not to be late for appointments. At the moment, the protagonist thought that previously heard rumors that Elias von Lockelber and the Emperor is not on good terms, and it seems to be true, as the Emperor was not once married. But when he married for the 4th time, Elias von Lockelber unleashed a bloody struggle, as a result of which the heir to the throne was determined. And it said that the emperor disliked this outcome, and the prince in turn also disliked his father. And then Maria Meyer thought that she was in any case disgusted by the fact that the prince was despised by his parents. But the next moment something surprised her, and she noticed that the prince's glass was empty, and the other maids did nothing because they were very much afraid of him. And so the protagonist calmly walked over to fill his glass. And at that moment, Elias von Lockelber looked at her strangely, as if she didn't know what was going on. And Maria Meyer did not understand such a reaction, though she reflected that apparently even the prince was frightened by the ghost of this palace. In the end, it didn't take long before Emperor Adolf von Lockelber appeared and stated that his son had come too early. But the prince smilingly replied that his father was late as usual. Eventually, they began their meal, and then Elias von Lockelber wanted to discuss the fact that his father had sent a letter to the Grand Duke. But the emperor calmly explained that he had deemed it necessary for the duke to be present at the prince's coronation. But Elias von Lockelber only said with a smile that the hero of the north should have stayed in the north where he belonged. But Adolf von Lockelber only grudgingly asked his son to behave himself and refrain from such expressions, because the duke was still an uncle to Elias von Lockelber. But Elias logically pointed out that he had an uncle he'd never even seen in his life. But at that moment, the disgruntled emperor ordered his son to shut up. And then looking around at all the maids who were walking excitedly standing around, Maria reflected that the atmosphere was indeed very tense. so much so that even the wine had managed to run out. And Maria Meyer wouldn't even be surprised if there were swords in the Prince Emperor's hands right now. Then she thought sadly that the prince also paid absolutely no attention to her. But for some reason, Maria Meyer thought that maybe Elias von Lonkelber was not like the others, and it was as if she subconsciously expected something from him. But at that moment, the maids began to discuss among themselves who the Great Duke was. Then they thought that if he was the prince's uncle, then he was the brother of their emperor, which was logical. Then the other girl said that 5 years ago, the Great Duke had gone to the north, and there were barbarians and bloodthirsty monsters. It was a troubled land before, but with the arrival of the Grand Duke, all that changed, and he was hailed as a hero of the empire for a reason. And then the maid asked why Elias von Lonkelber hated this man so much. But her friend said that it was logical, for the Grand Duke was the emperor's brother and the son of the past lord. And then the protagonist, who at that time was quietly eavesdropping on their conversation, thought that apparently the Grand Duke should be first in line to the throne because he was a member of the imperial family, and therefore he could rightfully claim the throne. And in the end, there were two men vying for power. The prince who didn't get along with his father and the Great Duke, the people's hero. And it was obvious which side the emperor would take. And then the power struggle would begin again. And then excitedly, the girl thought of the fact that their emperor wanted to make the Great Duke his heir. But the other maid asked that her friend not say anything of the sort. But this did not go unnoticed by the head maid, who ordered everyone to get to work, and then the excited maids immediately scattered to their places. And Maria Meyer thought that she had not heard of the Great Duke before, for there was nothing written about him in the book. And she wondered what kind of a man he was, and thought that surely this man was a very tough, manly Northman who fought monsters and could defeat any monster with a single blow, although she realized that perhaps she had exaggerated his abilities a bit. Then smiled and thought that it would be quite funny if even the heroes of the empire were scared and didn't notice her. But the next moment, when the protagonist was about to go out the door, she ran into Prince Elias and awkwardly glanced at him, thinking that apparently he had not returned to his palace. But because she started to step back too sharply, she got tangled in her legs and started to fall. But at that moment, Elias von Lonkelber managed to pick her up to keep her on her feet. And then, madly displaced by such actions, Maria Meyer did not understand what to do. And awkward Elias von Lonkelber stated that he did not expect such a sudden appearance, and asked that next time the protagonist should look where she was going. And then she awkwardly apologized, but the guy just walked on by. But all she could think about was that this situation was insanely weird, and it seems like the prince felt it too. And so, turning around on the protagonist, realized that he had not sensed the presence of this maid at all, and thought that maybe she was a planted assassin, and decided he should definitely look into it. Eventually, a month passed, and Maria Meyer, sitting on the grass for a bit of a break, thought that the Grand Duke had finally arrived, and she had been working for a month without rest preparing for his arrival. She took out a piece of bread and milk, thinking that being invisible was sometimes useful because she could get some food, and realized with a smile that even people who came from modern times would enjoy the palace food, and it was really delicious. But the next moment, the prince opened the window and reported that his interlocutor was good, and apparently even an assassin could sneak into the imperial palace. And then the shocked girl literally could not believe that Elias von Lonkelber had now noticed her. In the end, the prince's aide informed Elias von Lonkelber that the emperor would not call the Grand Duke without a reason. And then the guy said that the Grand Duke was a really famous man who had brought peace to the north. And the protagonist, who sat under the window agitated and didn't understand what situation she was in and what she should do now, because if she gets caught, it's not likely to end well, because she's not in any manga. And most likely she was expecting a completely different reaction, and imagining it, the girl realized that this was the most likely outcome. But at that moment, a worried assistant looked at Elias von Lonkelber and recommended him to close the window. But he calmly said that it was unlikely that anyone would come to an abandoned palace to listen to them, and then stated that he thought that he and his father were no longer enemies, for otherwise it would be strange to invite his youngest son, whom he had always despised, to dinner. But Henry awkwardly reported that the emperor was most likely against him becoming his successor, and earlier Henry hadn't even expected the emperor to be so stubborn, especially since he had even tried to drag the Grand Duke into the fray. And then the prince said with a smile that he was the son of a woman who had been dishonorably thrown out of the palace, and the emperor could do nothing about it. And he found it very amusing. Whereupon the prince reflected that he no doubt shared his father's feelings, but he did not feel the slightest respect for him ever then or now, and he won't let the emperor look down on him like he did before. And this time it will be as he wants it. And an agitated Maria Meyer, who was sitting under the window, thought about how she shouldn't have been eavesdropping and maybe she should have just run away. Then she thought about how lucky she was that no one noticed her, and so she slipped past the window while Elias von Lonkelber was contemplating the fact that after the coronation, not even the emperor could stop him, much less the Hertz, and even though they were still related. But the next moment the boy turned to look outside the window and thought it felt as if a maid had just crawled under the window. But he asked Henry to send an assassin to the Grand Duke. But the guy was just worried that the prince might be declassified and then it would end badly. But Elias von Lonkelber said that in fact he was just wondering how the Grand Duke would react to it, because he should know what kind of man his uncle really was, and he would be lucky if his uncle just considered him stupid and stubborn. The protagonist heard all this and she thought that maybe she was just imagining things. But the next moment she was shocked to think that she was eavesdropping again and realized that she had to get away from this place as soon as possible. She ended up doing just that and was now trying to catch her breath after her escape, wondering if she would ever go back to that place again. But looking at the crowd in front of me, I realized that the Grand Duke must have arrived. And then she saw a young man who was in the midst of his entourage and looked very much like the emperor, which was not strange, and he was also dressed inappropriately for the weather. And then in Maria's mind began to shatter the image of which she had previously pondered, because she really believed that the Great Duke is a severe Northman, but he turned out to be very elegant. And then the awkward Maria Meyer thought that this was the man Elias von Lonkelber was going to send an assassin to, but it was strange for her to hear about it. The Grand Duke was not a warrior, and he was a noble aristocrat, and it was not right to do such a thing to him. And Maria Meyer thought that she was very sorry to hear that, because she believed that everyone around her was wrong about the prince. But she realized that such thoughts should not be in the head of a maid, so she just ordered herself to forget about it. But eventually, she noticed that on the floor was someone's handkerchief beautifully embroidered with gold threads. And so she immediately turned her attention to it, and when the protagonist picked it up to see who the handkerchief belonged to, suddenly there was a voice of some guy coming up behind her. And then the Grand Duke smilingly thanked the protagonist for finding his handkerchief, and she couldn't believe that someone had just spoken to her first. But still, as the rules of propriety suggested, she bowed awkwardly and gave the handkerchief to the Duke, and he accepted it, thanked Maria Meyer, and said that this thing was insanely dear to him. Then asked what the girl's name was, but with a smile informed that he was in a bit of a hurry, but he would definitely want to thank the main character later. And then she awkwardly introduced herself by informing that she served in the Sapphire Palace. And leaving, the Duke said that he would surely find Mary when he had finished with all of his business. And the admiring girl looked around and thought that it was the first time she had seen a man who treated his servants so well, but then turned away and went about her business, realizing that even this man would forget her in just a minute, so she shouldn't even hope. But at that moment, all the Duke thought about was that he had been looking for this girl for an insanely long time and didn't realize where Maria Meyer had been all this time. As a result, the Grand Duke also immediately became the most discussed person in the palace, because he was the hero of the North and the young Grand Duke. It was only because of Beatrice's mild and pleasant character that the Duke could rightly be considered the most desirable groom in the empire. And Maria Meyer admitted that everywhere she went, she heard discussion about this young man. And then one of the maids said that Prince Elias von Lonkelber was indeed very nice, but the Grand Duke Dietrich was very affable. And then the girl awkwardly reflected that both these fellows were perfectly suited to her tastes. And though Elias von Lonkelber was indeed handsome, but his character was indeed unbearable. But the next moment, one of them turned to all the servants and asked which of them was Maria Meyer. The astonished maids looked at each other and tried to understand who this girl was, for they did not know anyone by that name. And Mina also told a girl's name, and also explained that Maria Meyer was needed by the Grand Duke, and explained that he turned to her because he probably knew that Maria Meyer worked in the Sapphire Palace. But then Maria Meyer came forward and said that apparently her name was her, but everyone looking around excitedly didn't understand when she was here. They didn't recognize her at all. But the next moment, the maid took the heroine by the hand and told her that nothing else mattered now, for Dietrich was waiting for her, and so they had to go and led the way. And the excited Maria Meyer reasoned that Dietrich had forgotten about her, and that he was the first person who had ever remembered her name. Finally, when they entered, the maid told Dietrich that she had brought the girl he had asked for and awkwardly asked the protagonist to introduce herself again, because Mina had already forgotten her name. But Dietrich smilingly looked at Maria and said that he was waiting for her, then thanked the other maid for bringing Maria and stated that now he could thank his savior, and asked the maid if she could bring them tea and cookies. And the cheerful maid said she would do as he ordered, and then she left at once. And the Duke approached the protagonist, taking her by the hand, sat her down on the table opposite himself. And the awkward girl absolutely did not understand such behavior of the young man. But Dietrich only calmly inquired how the girl had lived here all the time and whether she liked it here. But she only awkwardly thought that she had not expected the question, but declared that everything was all right, although she had no idea that the boy would be looking for her. But he took his, and the handkerchief said that earlier he had promised that he wanted to thank Maria, and said that this handkerchief belonged to his grandmother and it was their family heirloom, and that's why it was so important. And Dietrich's grandmother always took warm care of her grandson, and when he was young, and he lived with her in the Eastern Palace, and reported that the emperor also treated him well, but they didn't see each other very often. But Maria Meyer only paid attention to the knight that stood behind and thought about the fact that he stood there so inconspicuous, as if he were a ghost, that she was frightened, even though she usually played that role. Dietrich also said that at that time they grew wonderful apples, and his grandmother made delicious pies from them. In the end, the Duke talked about his childhood for a long time, and all this time it seemed to Maria that the man seemed to expect some kind of answer from her. And sometimes he looked directly into her eyes, as if he hoped to see something there. And so Maria Meyer felt very uncomfortable, because it was the first time in a long time that someone had spoken to her so casually, which made her really happy. But Dietrich, having finished, stated that he had told too much about himself and asked that Maria Meyer should also tell something about herself. But the nimble girl thought that she was obviously not ready for such a thing, and the whole situation looked as if Dietrich was trying to find out some information from her. And then she wondered shockingly that this was the man who had been in a power struggle with Elias von Lockelber, and apparently he was trying to find out something about the prince through her. And so she excitedly reported that unfortunately she really had nothing to tell and nothing interesting to tell in her life. But Dietrich said with a smile that in that case he wanted to find out for himself, and wondered what her favorite food was, and the girl only awkwardly thought that she liked anything that tasted good, and reflected that she really liked food from her past life. But at that moment Dietrich laughed, and the awkward Maria Meyer thought that when the Grand Duke behaved so casually around her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. Then the man said that they should definitely have dinner together, and at least that way he could thank the protagonist. But the next moment the door opened and everyone was shocked, not understanding how anyone could barge in so unceremoniously and without knocking. But it was Prince Elias von Lockelber who smilingly informed his uncle that he had brought the drinks as he had previously requested. But at that moment the Knight of the Grand Duke stood in front, protecting his lord from the uninvited guest. But the Duke calmly reassured Franz and said that everything was all right, and asked the prince why he had come. But the prince calmly said that he was going about his business, and by chance came upon a servant girl who said she was bringing the Duke tea. And so he ordered her to hand over the cart. But at this point Dietrich became much more serious and inquired what reason Elias von Lockelber had for doing so, if he had chosen even to bring him tea himself. But the lad only wondered stickily if the Duke was so much afraid that his tea might be poisoned. But Dietrich only informed him that it was too strange to hope that poison could have killed him. And the protagonist, who was around all the time, just thought that she just cannot be here anymore. But she continued to do her job and did it already by inertia and literally could not stop. But in the end, Elias von Lockelber smilingly said that he had not expected such a response from the Grand Duke, and that it was indeed a good joke. But the disgruntled Maria Meyer only reflected that she herself had heard that Elias von Lockelber had sent an assassin to her uncle. But eventually he shifted his gaze to the main character and seemed to only notice her, wondering what she was doing here. And it seemed to surprise him that they ran into her so often. The protagonist, making a bow, reflected that the prince was indeed very much surprised by her presence, and even more so than she imagined herself to be. But Dietrich calmly informed Elias von Lockelber that it was his guest, and she had picked up the handkerchief he had accidentally dropped. And then, thinking about it, Elias von Lockelber wondered if he could join them and hoped very much that no one was against it. But at that moment Dietrich only turned calmly to the girl, who was interested in what she thought about it. And the protagonist noticed that she had no objections, And hearing about it, the prince immediately sat down at the same table with them. And at that moment, Maria Meyer realized that this was really wonderful company, but clearly not for her. Then the prince asked if he had remembered her name correctly. And when she confirmed, his guest Beatrix said that her name was indeed beautiful, while Elias von Lonkelber only stated that it was quite ordinary. At this moment, looking at them, Maria Meyer realized only one thing, that these two were really perfect and very similar to each other, because they were relatives, and especially similar were the eyes. Then she thought that perhaps they were both more like the emperor, though the man was always as if he was dissatisfied with something. But interrupting the silence, Beatrix asked why Elias von Lonkelber had actually come to him, and whether he wanted to discuss something with him. But the boy admitted that he had come because he wanted to look at the sword, with the help of which the Great Duke was able to subdue the North, and thinking the Duke admitted that his blade was really famous, because just a good sword, northern monsters were very hard to defeat. Then Maria realized that Beatrix's words were strange, for it seemed to her that it was the Great Duke's skill and not the weapon that was the problem. But she turned her attention to the young man's hands and noticed that for an aristocrat, he had too many shamans on his hands. And imagining the picture of the fight, I realized that apparently his wounds were serious. But it was not mentioned in the novel, and it turns out that this world was different from the book. In the end, the prince asked to see the sword, and Beatrix did not argue and calmly brought it, starting to unwind the cloth in which it was hidden. And looking at it, all the prince said was that the sword was wonderful, as if it were a piece of jewelry. And Maria Meyer thought that it was probably the same legendary sword, but she didn't understand why it was so shiny, as if it had never been used. Looking at the weapons, Elias von Lonkelber said that he had heard that the steel from the north had magical properties. Beatrix confirmed his words and explained that it was the heritage of a long-extinct race of demons. And looking at Elias von Lonkelber, Maria Meyer realized that he was very fond of different swords and weapons. But the next moment, she wondered what reason the prince had for keeping silent after the phrase about demon heritage. But she noticed the Duke's glances. And the next moment, Maria Meyer realized that she felt as if this man knew her, but she didn't understand how, and didn't understand why he cared so much about her, and why she wanted to smile when she looked at him, and literally couldn't believe that this man was just trying to use her. But she realized that this kind of reasoning was just leading her down a blind alley. The next moment, Maria Meyer noticed the fact that Elias von Lonkelber's shirt had a blue hair from his head, and it was too conspicuous against the white background. And so Maria Meyer realized she'd like to remove it. If she did it carefully, the prince wouldn't even notice. But in the end, as soon as she grabbed the hair, then the prince immediately intercepted her hands and screamed, trying to find out what she was even doing. And then awkwardly, the protagonist tried to explain. But a disgruntled Beatrix intervened and told the prince that they had to make one thing clear, namely that Maria Meyer was his guest and was not to be spoken to rudely. And so Elias von Lonkelber had to be polite, as befitted a member of the imperial family, and the excited Maria Meyer, watching them, thought that these young men might now have a fight on their hands. So she screamed, saying that she had just seen a hair on Elias von Lonkelber's back and wanted to remove it discreetly. But the disgruntled Elias von Lonkelber inquired as to the reason why in such a case there was such a strange expression on Maria's face, and it looked suspicious. And she was surprised at such statements. But the next moment, she was approached by an agitated Beatrix, who asked if Maria was all right, and looking at her hand said that he was very sorry for what had happened, and apologized also for Elias von Lonkelber, saying that he had not done it on purpose. But Maria Meyer, excitedly looking at the men in front of her, did not understand why now the Grand Duke himself was apologizing to her. But then something even stranger happened, and such a thing from the prince the girl did not expect. In the end, looking at Elias von Lonkelber, all that Maria Meyer thought about is that with him should be clearly more careful and do not make any sudden movements, because it seems that such a thing scares him very much. And so she apologized, saying she should have warned the young man in the first place. But he reported that Maria had nothing to apologize for, and apologized in return, reporting that he had indeed acted rashly. And it was due to the fact that she was completely unaware of her presence. He added that it was the first time he had ever had such a strange sensation, and Maria Meyer awkwardly wondered if it might be due to the fact that the prince was engrossed in a conversation about swords. But at that moment, the girl was thinking and decided that no one could trust her because of her peculiarity. And if she was wrong, there would be trouble, because people like to explain everything by the supernatural. The prince was only grudgingly contemplating the fact that it absolutely didn't matter that Maria Meyer had actually been taken by surprise, He shouldn't have reacted so harshly, and she must be in pain because he was too rough on her. Then remembering her hand, which he intercepted and thought that her hand was very thin and looked fragile. But Elias von Lonkelber did not understand for what reason such strange thoughts appeared in his mind. But noticing his agitation, Maria Meyer asked if everything was all right, and the madly embarrassed prince only wondered that Maria Meyer looked too innocent and literally begged her to stop looking at him so pitifully. And so he covered her face with his hand and ordered her to turn away and not look at him again. And Dietrich and his knights who watched in shock were unaware of this behavior. And Maria Meyer only awkwardly thought that Elias von Lonkelber was acting ridiculously strange, but he had warm, pleasant hands. Then she thought about the fact that slowly the image of the Blood Prince was fading from her mind, and yet she shouldn't have believed the rumors. In the end, after all this had happened, an embarrassed Elias von Lonkelber said that it was time for him to leave. And as soon as he said that, he immediately ran away, and Maria Meyer and Dietrich were left alone. So the guy asked what the girl wanted to do, and Mary asked if the Duke had any suggestions. And then he calmly said that he did have a lot of ideas. And the awkward girl noticed that there was a great deal of space in the room, and did not realize for what reason Dietrich sat so close. And then Dietrich carefully opened and the girl inquired if she would like to touch his hair. And then the protagonist, shocked at such an offer, refused. She thought about the fact that the Duke's hair seemed to shine even brighter in the sunlight, as if it were made of gold. But in the end, Dietrich again suggested that she not be shy and just touch his hair. And then the girl refused so vehemently that she began to fall from her chair and ended up falling awkwardly, thinking of that unfortunately no one caught her this time, so she was insanely embarrassed. But the Duke immediately rose from his seat and went up to Mary Meyer and inquired if she was all right and if she was hurt. Then he asked with a smile if Maria Meyer really didn't remember him at all. Then he asked her to remember something before the next meeting and not to forget what they had in common. In the end, the time spent together was over and Maria Meyer was out the door, thinking that she should not have promised Dietrich that they would meet again, because she would have to spend the day with him again, which made her very tired. And she wondered if Dietrich was trying to contact her because she knew something or someone. But even if it was true, the old Maria Meyer knew about it and thought it was unlikely that she could forget such an attractive man. But in the end, Elias von Lonkelber approached her the next moment. And then a surprised Maria Meyer wondered if he had been here all this time. But he calmly suggested they go for a walk. Eventually, while they were walking, a disgruntled Elias von Lonkelber reported that the Duke was acting too strangely, and he also heard some rumbling as he was leaving. But Maria Meyer awkwardly confessed that it was really all right, because she had only fallen and nothing terrible had happened, and thought that she had fallen from her seat like a helpless infant. Then the surprised prince inquired if Maria was all right, and she was only surprised at such attention and asked if Elias von Lonkelber was worried about her. But at that moment, the prince embarrassedly informed her that he had no reason not to worry about Maria Meyer. And she awkwardly reflected that she had only asked a question, and he clearly shouldn't have reacted that way. After which she thought that perhaps the prince was also trying to determine the Duke's weaknesses, and she was just begging that these men leave her out of their fight. She ended up apologizing to the prince and informing him that she had a lot more work to attend to. And then looking behind Maria, Elias von Lonkelber realized that this was the first time he had ever encountered such a strange person. But afterwards, excited, he remembered that it was probably the same girl he had met earlier in the canteen, and realized that even then she had seemed suspicious to him. And so he decided to find out more about her, but it seemed like she'd forgotten all about it, and it wasn't like him. So she promised him that this time he'd find out something for sure. As a result, in the information he had prepared, he learned that Maria Meyer was a maid from the Sapphire Palace, and she had been serving His Majesty for 2 years. But she had only been working in the Sapphire Palace for 6 months. But in the palace itself, hardly anyone had heard of her, so the prince didn't understand how he should even take in such information. But an embarrassed Henry admitted that even the head maid didn't remember anything about the main character. And then Elias von Lonkelber inquired where the girl was from, but the lad awkwardly informed her that she was from somewhere in the east, but he was not sure. And then astonished Elias von Lonkelber wondered if anyone had let a servant girl, about whom absolutely nothing was known, near the imperial family. But the guy said he hadn't finished his investigation yet, but very little was known about Maria Meyer. So Henry was beginning to wonder if the girl even existed. And then thinking about it, Elias von Lonkelber realized that there was definitely something strange about this maid. And maybe she was working undercover, which would explain why she's trying to keep a low profile. And she didn't even have to hide because it's like she disappears or vaporizes. But at first glance, there was nothing special about her. Her appearance, height, and figure were also ordinary. But Elias von Lonkelber was concerned that the Grand Duke was so interested in this girl and thought that perhaps Maria Meyer had originally served Dietrich and realized that such possibilities should not be excluded. But the assistant suggested that the Duke could simply fall in love with this girl. But disgruntled Elias von Lonkelber only stated that his assistant could not talk such nonsense, to which he reasonably remarked that Elias von Lonkelber had never experienced the feeling of love yet, because girls considered him too cold and aloof. But at that moment, a girl came into the room and said that the imperial family would most likely end with Elias von Lonkelber. It was Duchess Hildegard von Wattelbach, who stated that Elias von Lonkelber would soon be recognized as heir to the throne. But she didn't know how long the boy would be able to hold his power, and stated that he needed to find a suitable partner from a powerful family so that he could strengthen his position. But Elias von Lonkelber didn't like to talk about marriage, so he said that it wasn't even the coronation yet, so it was too early for him to think about marriage. And first, there must be a welcoming ball in the Grand Duke's honor, and if we have a wedding now, it will be an exorbitant expense, even for the imperial family. But grudgingly, Hildegard von Wattelbach wondered if Elias von Lonkelber had just compared the wedding to a welcome ball. But he calmly said that it was never too late to get married, and that he would always have time. But the restless Hildegard von Wattelbach remarked that they should in any case start looking for a bride for Elias von Lonkelber who was worthy, and said that there seemed to be a girl who was very interested in the young man. And then the displeased prince, looking over his workmen, immediately realized that it seemed that someone had too long a tongue, and it was he who had told Hildegard von Wattelbach all about it. But afterward, he calmly explained that he had no interest in that girl, for she was a mere servant girl, and he had no noble roots in her. But Hildegard von Wattelbach had rather remarked that if a girl liked Elias von Lonkelber, it didn't matter whether she was a maid or a butcher's daughter. But she wondered whether Elias von Lonkelber could be liked by anyone at all, and noticed that the love experience before marriage is also very important. But the dissatisfied guy noticed that he doesn't want to waste his time on feelings or on the person with whom he won't connect his life in the future. And the displeased Hildegard wondered if Elias von Lonkelber really expected that when he had arranged the wedding, he and his bride would have time to hold hands and give each other presents and dates, and asked if the boy had ever held a girl's hand, for he could not even dance. But at this point, the disgruntled guy stated that just the other day he had been in contact with girls, then wondered if that girl was exactly Maria Meyer, and it was the first time he had touched someone in years. And think about it, he blushed very much, and noticing this, Hildegard von Wattelbach seemed even pleased to inquire as to the cause. But a disgruntled Elias von Lonkelber said that he was a future emperor and therefore not going to chase every skirt, and informed Hildegard von Wattelbach that she had to leave. But she had only recently noticed that with a character like the prince's, she didn't see how anyone could love him at all. In the end, when Hildegard von Wattelbach withdrew, Elias von Lonkelber thought he saw all this girl's efforts on his behalf. For Elias von Lonkelber and Hildegard von Wattelbach, loved ones were not a reliable support for their enemies. They were like brother and sister to each other and had no one else to rely on, and Hildegard von Wattelbach was really worried that he might die alone. But in the end, the prince told Hildegard von Wattelbach that he would treat her to dinner, and if she wanted, she could also bring her husband, and the girl gladly agreed. In the end, the prince further examined the papers and found that Maria Meyer was only cleaning and washing dishes, and perhaps she was the famous ghost of the Sapphire Palace, and asked Henry to come up for a moment, but found that his assistant was not present. While Hildegard von Wattelbach was interrogating him, wondering who was the maid who had taken such a great liking to Elias von Lonkelber, and he was already thinking excitedly that he was sure to be killed by the prince. But Henry did admit that it was Maria Meyer, a common maid who had recently spoken to the Grand Duke. But at that moment, the madly surprised Hildegard von Wattelbach could not believe that an ordinary maid could be so much interested in Dietrich, and moreover had already managed to fall in love with Elias von Lonkelber, and wondered if they were having a love triangle. But thinking about their relationship, Henry realized that Dietrich was too sarcastic and his Lord Prince was too rude, and in the middle of it all, the main character was very scared, and as if she didn't know what she was doing here. So she said that she didn't think that the girl was interested in both of them at once. But Hildegard noticed that from the outside it was difficult to see what was going on between the lovers. and so they shouldn't miss the opportunity, and asked Henry to bring her the maid Maria, for she wanted to see the girl who had won their prince's heart. In the end, the protagonist sadly reflected on the fact that she really did not want to see Dietrich again and tried to avoid him. But as luck would have it, the Duke showed up where she was. And when he saw her, he immediately invited her to dinner, and she just couldn't refuse. And the girl didn't even know what to do with it because she didn't even have a suitable outfit because all her dresses were ugly. And these dresses were like mold or moss, and Maria realized that she would have to buy something new. And there wasn't much time left, so she had to act fast. But in the end, she passed several stores and each of them was closed. So Maria Meyer did not understand what it was connected with because today was not a holiday or even a day off. But she was thinking that I should have checked a few more places. But every place she went to, she saw the same sign saying they were closed. So she was getting desperate, not sure what was going on because she could have been late. But at that moment, a man came up and said that this store was also closed. But it seems that he saw one working store, and then in one breath said that you had to go straight ahead and then to the right. And there was a fruit store and a dark alley. And when you come out of the dark alley, the store will be on the left. But the next moment when Henry turned around to make sure Maria had gotten her way, he realized the girl was already gone. At this time, Maria Meyer was running along the path that the man had indicated to her and thought that his voice was very familiar. But eventually, when she got to the store, she saw the sign and realized that it wasn't a cheap store, but it was open. So she entered and said hello, and on the sofa sat Hildegard von Wattelbach, who, turning to Henry, inquired if he should watch their purpose and did not even notice the protagonist. And so she tapped the girl on the shoulder and told her that her store was open and she'd like to buy something. And then, literally shown Hildegard, said that she could show her everything and asked what dress she needed for the date, saying that her dress the color of wilted aloe was absolutely not suitable. But upon hearing of the date, Maria Meyer awkwardly said that the occasion was something else altogether. But at that moment, the surprised Hildegard von Wattelbach inquired, what was a dinner with the Grand Duke if not a date? And the shocked Maria Meyer looked around her and wondered how this girl knew about such a thing. But at that moment, Henry suddenly burst into the store and shouted from the threshold that their target had suddenly disappeared, and so he had lost her. But seeing the protagonist immediately felt awkward. Eventually, Hildegard von Wattelbach realized that their plan had failed, so she apologized and introduced herself, saying that she was the Duchess. And then the shocked girl literally could not believe that in front of her now appeared such a great man, and also the right hand of the prince. Hildegard von Wattelbach said that she was very fond of the store and therefore did not want to frighten the girl. But Maria Meyer only thought about the fact that all the other closed stores must have something to do with Hildegard von Wattelbach, because it was hardly a coincidence and Hildegard von Wattelbach wanted to see her for a reason. But in the end, the girl showed her to the dressing room and asked her to go through in order to take measurements, after which she would choose the appropriate outfits. And Maria Meyer thought that it was better not to contradict such a person, so she agreed. A little time passed, and having taken the measurements, the Duchess asked Maria to wait a little while she brought her some dresses to choose from, and the girl awkwardly agreed, and thought about the fact that during the measuring, the Duchess kept asking her about boyfriends and what kind of men she liked, and she was in a relationship. And she also asked her directly what kind of guys she liked more, like Dietrich or like Elias von Lockelber. And the protagonist realized that it was a difficult question. After that, she began to ponder what such behavior was connected with, and thought that perhaps when she removed a hair from the prince's back, she'd indeed done a foolish thing, and apparently the prince was displeased. But Hildegard von Wattelbach, on the contrary, looked happy. In the end, while Maria Meyer was waiting, she thought about the fact that many aristocrats had their own clothing store, and it was a kind of hobby, and wondered if the prince had similar hobbies. But I thought it was more likely that Elias von Lockelber just didn't have time for them, especially now that the time of the coronation was approaching. But that's when Elias von Lockelber came into the locker room looking for Hildegard. But seeing the main character, he blushed with embarrassment and asked why the girl was in such a form. And then she awkwardly realized that now she was literally in her underwear. And then, unable to stand it, the guy threw her things and ordered her to get dressed while he waited outside and abruptly closed the curtain. At this time, Elias von Lockelber was awkwardly reflecting on the fact that Hildegard von Wattelbach had explained absolutely nothing to him and did not understand how Maria Meyer could be in this place. For Hildegard usually held secret meetings and gatherings here, and the prince did not know how the maid could be here. Eventually, Maria Meyer reported that she had dressed, and an awkward Elias von Lockelberg convinced her that he had no time to see anything, but apologized again. And at that moment, just as the main character was getting dressed, Hildegard von Wattelbach came in with beautiful clothes and apologized for keeping Maria Meyer waiting. But the prince was madly displeased at her appearance and asked Hildegard von Wattelbach to go away with him to talk for a few minutes. But the girl was already aware of what awaited her. In the end, they went into another room, and displeased Elias von Lonkelber asked what Hildegard von Wattelbach was thinking, for the girl should have realized it herself, that Maria Meyer might be working for the Duke, and asked Hildegard to stop looking for trouble on her own head. But the Duchess asked if the prince was so worried that the Duke might find out about her secret place. Then she said that her place looked like an ordinary store and did not arouse suspicion, and her husband was a fashion designer, and even the prince's brothers could not find the place. But they are happy Elias von Lonkelber said that if until now no one suspected that this is a secret place, it does not mean that it will always be so, and told him that the Grand Duke had come to the palace and this maid was the first person he'd spoken to. And so they had to find out who she really was, and he thought they were planning something. But in the end, a disgruntled Elias von Lonkelber said that Hildegard von Wattelbach could do as she wished, but she must not forget that if anything went wrong with their plan, they were unlikely to be left alive. And Hildegard von Wattelbach simply couldn't pass up such an opportunity, and so as soon as Despardes learned that the Grand Duke was making an appointment with Maria, the Duchess ordered him to pretend to be one of the attendants and follow. And it was the perfect plan. But afterwards, Hildegard smilingly announced that there was now a much more important topic, and asked which dress would suit Marie best. But Hildegard von Wattelbach called Maria by the wrong name, and so displeased Elias von Lonkelber corrected her. Maria Meyer thought about the fact that it was not the first time Hildegard had called her by a different name. Afterwards, the worried Maria Meyer tried to calm her raging heart, as she was really pleased that the prince knew her name. But she told Hildegard von Wattelbach that she didn't have much time, so any outfit would suit her. But at that moment, the prince said that the yellow dress was the one the Duke would like best. And then the main character thanked him happily and went straight into the fitting room. Hildegard von Wattelbach at this time wondered how the prince knew what the Duke would like, and whether he had chosen the outfit according to his own taste. But the prince calmly declared that whatever Maria Meyer had done, Dietrich would still have said she looked beautiful to make her feel at ease. But the next moment, the protagonist calmly stated that she was ready, and when she came out, she excitedly reflected on the fact that it was the first time she had worn something so colorful. And the embarrassed prince reflected that it actually looked even better than he might have thought, and Hildegard von Wattelbach was literally delighted by the girl's appearance. But at this point, the prince awkwardly informed her that Maria Meyer was in a hurry, and he had to get back to the palace so he could let her down. And they ended up leaving together. And Hildegard von Wattelbach, who was watching this picture, thought that it was the first time she had ever seen Elias von Lonkelber escort a girl, and asked Henry to follow them, and also to find out what the Duke wanted with the maid. But looking more seriously at the lad, she demanded that this time he not miss the maid. Elias von Lonkelber ended up watching the protagonist try to get on a horse, and awkwardly reported that she should have been warned right away that she wasn't riding. But she awkwardly reflected that she expected them to ride a carriage. And then by putting the girl on the horse said that if she didn't know how to ride, in that case he would help her. The main character did not understand what was happening to her and why she was so excited. But the prince, noticing her anxiety, inquired if Mary was all right, for she was very tense, and also asked her not to look down if she was afraid. Then apologized for what happened today and said that Hildegard likes to have fun, and she did not want to harm the main character in any way. And then hearing about it, Maria Meyer thought that the prince was usually very aloof, but it turns out he cared for her a little bit. But she knew that this would not happen again, because when the prince was recognized as the heir to the throne, he would get even more power, and they were like from different worlds. And the prince will have to fight the Duke for the throne because Maria Meyer doubted their emperor would side with the prince. And Maria Meyer realized that it was unlikely that the young man would remember her at all by that time. But Maria Meyer realized that it was not worth thinking about bad things for the moment, because she looked like she did when they first met. And a surprised Maria Meyer wondered if he remembered that. But Elias von Lonkelber calmly reported that they had met her not that long ago, and he had a pretty good memory. But hearing this, the protagonist smiled happily, thinking that the prince had indeed remembered her, and the latter was embarrassed not to understand such a reaction. Eventually, when they got off the horse, they saw that there were really a lot of people around, and the prince warned that there were other ways, but that they would have to walk even longer, and said they had better split up since they were almost at the palace, and if they were spotted together, there would be trouble for both him and Mary. And then he bought flowers, and putting them in the hair of the main character explained that it was impossible to go to a dinner with a member of the imperial family without jewelry, and it was better to go like this than to go without anything at all. After that, Elias von Lonkelber smilingly looked at Maria and said that it was very nice, and the awkward Maria Meyer thanked and said that she still had to pay for the dress and the shoes, but the prince explained that it was a gift. And then the protagonist would look back gratefully at the prince as he walked away. In the end, all Elias von Lonkelber thought about was that the girl seemed to have left something unsaid, but there was nothing else suspicious. And he didn't realize why he was always doing something stupid around Maria, because he was constantly haunted by embarrassing memories. Eventually, when Maria Meyer was at dinner and Dietrich said he still wanted to know the answer to his question, he asked if the protagonist remembered him, but Maria Meyer awkwardly reported that she had thought about his words and never remembered him. And the Duke with a smile said that in that case, nothing could be changed, but asked that Maria Meyer did not forget about him anymore. And then an uncomfortable Maria thought about the fact that if they continued to see each other so often, she wouldn't be able to forget this man. But she didn't understand what was really between the original Maria and Dietrich. And she didn't understand how a maid who was completely unnoticed by anyone could ever get to know the Grand Duke. And most likely Dietrich was only trying to get close to the girl, because he had once been very close to the old Maria, and wondered what would happen if the Grand Duke found out that Maria's body had been controlled by another man. But in any case, it was best to keep claiming that she didn't remember anything. Eventually, the protagonist noticed the Duke's hand and noticed the wound there. He noticed that Maria was so shot and asked what it was about, and the girl awkwardly confessed that she was interested in the wound on Dietrich's arm. And then he said that he understood this reaction. He had a lot of scars because of them. He probably looks more severe. But he asked Maria Meyer not to worry, because although he had received these wounds not long ago, but they would soon live because he had good regeneration. And thinking about it, Maria Meyer wondered how this was possible and whether it could be a peculiarity of the imperial family, then realized that perhaps instead of the blood of the Grand Duke was some kind of healing ointment, but remembered that there was magic in this world. But at that moment, Dietrich said with a smile that he had actually prepared a dress for Maria, but when he went to her to give it to her, he was told that she had already left. Then the girl thought that she must have tried so hard in vain if Dietrich had already kindly taken care of everything. But then she remembered Elias von Lonkelber and realized that maybe it wasn't all for nothing after all. But the next moment, Dietrich smilingly said that he just couldn't help but notice that this dress really suited the main character perfectly, and she happily thanked him for such a compliment. Then Dietrich also said that he liked the flower in the girl's hair very much, and Maria calmly admitted that it was a gift from Prince Elias von Lonkelber. But seeing the Duke's stern face, she explained that they had bumped into each other quite by accident when she was returning to the palace. And then the Duke with a smile said that Elias von Lonkelber had really very good taste, as the flower perfectly matched the dress, and wondered if the boy had also chosen the dress. Then the Duke thought that apparently he had embarrassed Mary with such a question, and besides, she looked as if she were hiding something. Then the Duke thought about the fact that he thought that Maria Meyer had just changed, because they had not seen each other for a long time. But now it seemed to him that in front of him was a completely different person. Though sometimes she acts just as she did when they were children, Dietrich thought that perhaps he had been deceiving himself, for he wanted to believe it very much. For since then he, too, had changed beyond recognition. And then an embarrassed Maria Meyer said that she had no idea that Dietrich had also prepared a dress for her, and she was terribly sorry. But then the Duke inquired if the protagonist wanted to make amends if she felt guilty, and asked if the girl could give him the flower she had in her hair. And then the excited girl thought about the fact that this flower was given to her by Elias von Lonkelber. But if she refused, she would upset the Duke, so there was no choice. And then taking the flower, Dietrich thanked Maria and suggested that we return to dinner. Maria Meyer eventually returned to the palace after a while and thought about the fact that she was initially very worried. But everything had gone much better than she had imagined. But I was still offended by the flower. Afterwards, I thought that Herzen had obviously had some oddities with him and concluded that he was a human being, and awkwardly thought about the fact that the Duke had invited her to the picnic again and didn't understand what was so special about her. In the end, the knight asked Dietrich if he really wants to use Maria, But he calmly stated that it seems the knight also noticed that Prince Elias von Lonkelboer shows an overly fervent interest in Maria, and he was even given a flower, and that was too great an honor for a mere servant, and informed that they were not to be left behind either, and so they would use every means to get to the prince, and demanded that the knight send Maria this very dress. And he thought that they say it's better to let go of your first love, and they weren't the same as they were before. Finally, at this time, the knight from the Order of Shadows was thinking about the fact that this wasn't the first time he had stalked someone, but there was clearly something wrong with this maid. And then everyone thought that even if Michael had missed the maid, there was obviously something strange about her, and asked Henry what he could say about Maria Meyer, for it seems he had followed the girl on orders from Hildegard von Wattelwacht. It was Knight Louise. And then Henry confessed that he was following Maria, but suddenly the trail disappeared, and then everyone around them literally could not believe that Maria Meyer could escape from their famous General Henry, because it was really incredible. And then Elias von Lonkelboer thought that the original reason he had decided to split up with Maria was that he had sensed surveillance. The Order of Shadows are the best knights he's ever known, and they haven't missed a single murderer or traitor, yet they can't follow the maid. But at this point, Louise wondered if perhaps the maid was a witch, but Henry sensibly pointed out that it was probably an archmage, for the witch had not been heard from in over 100 years. But in the end, Elias von Lonkelboer disgruntled ordered everyone to shut up as they would still have a chance to prove themselves, and he thought about the fact that Dietrich had already lured many capable knights to the north, and he simply could not allow the Great Duke to further consolidate his power in the palace. And if this maid really had any powers, he'd have to get her on his side. And then I thought about the fact that everything is happening over and over again, and it's very similar to this situation with Felicia, when she said she was sorry, but she had to leave the Empire. But the next moment, there was a knock on the door, and the girl said she was Maria Meyer and had been told she was expected. And then all the knights excitedly awaited her entrance, while Maria Meyer quietly contemplated the occasion for which she had been summoned. Finally, as soon as Henry opened the door, he noticed that there was absolutely no one there, so he wondered if they had all heard it. But when he looked back, he noticed that Maria Meyer was already in the room, and he didn't understand when this girl had even gotten in because he had just opened the door. And the next moment, Louise was pouncing upon the protagonist with a knife, and leaning her blades against her throat, awaited a command from Elias von Lonkelboer, while the agitated Maria Meyer asked for help. And then the prince ordered Louise to retreat, and Elias von Lonkelboer apologized for his knight, saying that Louise could sometimes be too impulsive, and he was sorry it had happened. Then the girl introduced herself as this knight, and then everyone got excited thinking that for her abilities, she had a name that was too common, and realized that either it was made up or she was living under a false name. And Louise thought about the fact that she definitely couldn't be fooled, and Maria had an aura hiding ability, and it was clearly much stronger than Louise had previously expected. But in the end, the Duke called Maria Meyer closer and invited her to sit down, and then asked her how his dinner with the Grand Duke had gone. And then the protagonist calmly reported that everything had gone well enough, and she felt very uncomfortable since there were no attentive gazes of each of the knights. And so she was trying to find an object that she could look at so she wouldn't feel so awkward, and that object was a candlestick. And noticing this, the prince immediately recognized that the decoration of the Sapphire Palace or the Emerald Palace, where Maria Meyer had previously worked, was no worse than such candlesticks, and wondered if she hadn't gotten used to the luxury around her. Then with a smile, he asked if the girl wanted him to show her the Crystal Palace. That's what they ended up doing. Then as they walked along, the girl thought about the fact that Elias von Lonkelboer had earlier forbidden his knight to follow them, and so she pondered what the prince even wanted to talk to her about. But the guy looked her over and wondered what the girl wanted. Food, jewelry, or anything else, because he could give her anything. But she only calmly stated that she would like a place where she could be alone. And then with a smile, the prince looked at her and admitted that he understood such a desire, because he also liked to be alone. After that, the young man became in the most spectacular pose and also rewarded Maria with a charming smile and asked if she would be his. But the protagonist didn't even hesitate to say no right away. And at that moment, the thrilled prince, who had not expected such a thing, literally couldn't believe how Maria Meyer had turned down someone like him, and thought that no one had ever blown him off so brazenly before. So his self-esteem took a serious hit at that moment. Then he thought that Maria Meyer had already served Dietrich, and that all suspicions were justified. Then informed her that he could give Maria a separate room, as well as give her wealth to the power of communication, anything she wanted, and Maria only had to ask for it. But each time she calmly refused without any expression on her face, though she pondered unhappily as to the reason why the prince was doing something like this for a common maid. In the end, the prince's self-esteem was so shattered that all he could do was calmly ask Maria to turn to him if she changed her mind. And then the protagonist quietly said goodbye and left. As a result, after such an incident, rumors spread around the palace that the prince was rejected by a simple maid. Eventually, when the rumors came out that Louise was being punished, and then with her hands shaking under the weight of the books, the girl reported that she was really sorry. But such a punishment was too cruel, after which she tearfully asked who one had to be so rude as to refuse their prince. And the disgruntled Elias von Lonkelber only wondered if it was Louise who had told Hildegard von Wadelbach everything. But Louise explained that she thought that Hildegard could help them. And then Elias von Lonkelber thought that Hildegard had indeed often helped him and acted as if his problems were hers. But sometimes he would be better off without the girl's advice. Louise awkwardly said she didn't understand how such gossip could turn into a declaration of love. And Henry remarked that the rumors had already spread beyond the borders of the empire. And dissatisfied, Elias von Lonkelber only reflected that it did not matter to him at all that he should marry as soon as possible. But calling a maid to marry was clearly a bad idea, but remembered Hildegard von Wadelbach, who constantly advised him to simply propose to Mary, because then she would not be able to refuse the prince and would be on his side. But in the end, in order to distract himself, the prince inquired what Maria Meyer was doing and also how Dietrich was behaving, and learned that the girl was going about her business as usual, and Dietrich is always hitting on her. The knight also added that most likely the Duke had already realized which servant was the rumored maid, and the prince grudgingly reflected that the situation now looked as if he would be competing with his uncle over a maid. At which time Dietrich, being at tea, apologized to Maria Meyer for so sudden an invitation, and reported with a smile that he had been served a really incredibly delicious tea and wanted to share a similar pleasure with Maria. Eventually, the Duke asked if the protagonist liked tea, after which he recalled that she had previously claimed to like everything delicious. And at that moment, awkward Mary only wondered why the Duke was drinking tea with her instead of doing his own thing. After all, the Duke must have had some duties since the coronation was coming up, especially since the Duke had also recently presented her with a dress. And because of that dress, she had to go to a meeting with him after all. But after thinking that eating too often started to haunt bad thoughts, and tried to distract herself by turning her attention to the Duke's food. And looking at the main character, the Duke only thought that thanks to the delicious food, it was easy enough to forget about any problems. After which he said with a smile that not too long ago, he had heard rumors that had been going around the palace. And then the protagonists sadly realized what the rumors were about, because the maids were also discussing that the prince had recently confessed his love. And I heard about it, and I thought it was very unlike the prince to reveal his feelings to anyone. But at that moment, I got really sad. After which the Duke stated that there were rumors that the prince had proposed to a simple maid and asked if I knew the girl. But when he received her negative answer, he said that although he did not want to jump to conclusions, he thought that the maid was the main character. And from such a statement, Maria was really shocked. After which she thought about it, probably she thought so too, but the prince had just been offered a job. So she informed the Duke that the rumors were lies. And then the Duke said with a smile that he was very interested in what had actually happened and what exactly the prince had said. And then the protagonist said that nothing special happened there, so she can't even remember. And the guy thought that it was just gossip, which was spread by the prince, especially since none of the imperial family and special prince did not confess his love directly and told the protagonist that he would like to help her understand. And so the girl reported everything that had happened that day, and then the Duke listened and said that it was definitely a declaration of love, and he had no idea that Mary was so fond of the prince. But the girl only reflected that if this was indeed a confession, then apparently their prince was in over his head. Then the protagonist realized that this conversation was getting more and more awkward. But instead of letting her go back to work, the Duke asked his knight to bring the girl another cup of tea. Finally, when she had drunk her tea, she thought it etiquette to leave and rose from her seat, informing the Duke that it was time for her to go. But because she rose too sharply, the cup with hot tea spilled on the Duke's hand, leaving a burn on his hand, and the knight excitedly ran to fetch a healer. And then the protagonist decided to provide first aid and told the Duke that he would soon recover, and the main thing is not to forget to change the bandage. And she thought guiltily that she had risen too abruptly, but she realized that she had been with the Duke too long already and she had to go. So she asked the Duke if she could leave, as the doctor had already finished his examination. and apologized again, saying that she should have been careful. Finally, the Duke apologized to Maria for delaying her so much and said that she could be free.